Yeah, we're really pleased we've got Jeremy here today. We kind of ambushed him on a Zoom conversation. You're like, well, I'm going now. There's just something else we wanted to ask you. And so we invited him to come and talk at the AGM. So Jeremy is a writer, is a poet, is an essayist, a reviewer. We were just talking just now, he's one of the select few that manages to get their reviews of poetry books into the Telegraph. Is it one, what did you say, one a month?
Well, not me, but they
no.
One a month.
Yeah. So it's a very small slot, but we're fighting to get poetry out there. He writes a really beautiful Substack blog of a series of very beautiful essays. I think blog sort of undersells it a little bit, but it's a series of very beautiful essays about poetry, and we'll take a particular theme or poet, and the insights are very fresh and very insightful, and there's often references to Larkin, and I think this is just one of the things that we've really enjoyed reading. I was having a look at them earlier on. You were saying you know the trees off by heart.
No, I know the beginning.
Oh, just the beginning. Okay. Do you want to give it a
go? The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said.
Oh,
recent buds relax and spread. Their greenest is a kind of.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, Jeremy's actually writing a book about Philip Larkin at the moment, so this is going to be a sort of collection of essays and thoughts about Larkin. It's not going to be academic, it's going to be an accessible piece of work, and I think that would be fantastic if we can, support Jeremy to get that to publication and get that out there. And I think there is a good. I mean, we know there's a lot of love for Philip Larkin, a lot of interest, a real resurgence in Larkin, interest in Larkin, I think, over the last few years. And I think, poetry in general has got a very strong voice in culture in the UK at the moment. So I think, something like that I think would be fantastic, see that come to publication. And I think doing events like this, it's encouraging you to get to that stage. So yeah, that'll be brilliant. Jeremy's going to talk about the less deceived. This year we've been trying to celebrate the less deceived because it's the anniversary of since it was published in 1955. Obviously, a publication that has its roots elsewhere outside of Hull, because much of it was written in Belfast, and even poems from before Larkin went to Belfast. But in other ways, it does have its roots very much in Hull because it was published here, and so it brings so much together as a publication. It's got the poems that we're so familiar with, like Church Going, but it also has a number of poems that we perhaps don't read very often. So it's a very interesting collection. We did the podcast, and hopefully some of you will have listened to earlier on this year, where we had the whole collection being read. So it's really been a really nice year to look at the less deceived, and we're really happy to sort of end the year with an exploration of the collection. We'll have a bit of a Q&A afterwards as well. So Jeremy's very happy to kind of have a chat with any of us that have got any. It's gone off. That killed it. That's my time to go, isn't it? Okay, so yeah, we can just welcome Jeremy.
I'm going to try and do this with the notes there, but yeah, we'll see how it goes. And can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Great. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Lyn, for that introduction. It's very kind. Like Lyn says, I write a lot about Larkin, mostly on the blog, but also sometimes in magazines and that kind of thing. He's one of those writers where once you start writing about him, you realise just how many other people want to read about him, and then you get encouraged to write. So this is, exactly like Lyn says, it's been something that I've been writing more and more about over the last few years, but I mean, I've read Larkin ever since I was a teenager, and Larkin was one of the poets who, outside of school, made me realise that poetry was something that I wanted to spend a lot of time with. Like Lyn says, it was a bit of an ambush, the introduction. I thought we were talking about the podcast, which is I really encourage you to listen to. It's a really good introduction to the book, really, because you get all these different voices bringing these poems to life, and you realise quite how different the poems are from the way that you thought they might be, I think, when you hear them in a different voice, especially different accents, different, men and women reading as well. And we were talking about trying to get some publicity for the podcast, because I've been trying to needle out some of these celebrity speakers from Lyn for a couple of weeks, sort of saying, could you tell me who they are? Because I think this is a story, I could give it to a journalist. And we decided we would go to Rachel Cook, who is and was a brilliant writer, as you might have seen in the last newsletter. She sadly passed away only a few weeks ago. And that came as a complete surprise to a lot of people. I think it had been very, as often these illnesses are, it had been very fast. And I'd been emailing her over the summer about this podcast, and I had no idea that she was ill. But she was really supportive, and I emailed her and I said, look, they've got Kate Blanchett reading. You're going to want to write about this. And I got this email back immediately that said, basically called me out and said, no, you don't. She couldn't believe it. I had to say, yes, it is Kate Blanchett, I will get you the files. And then I sent them over, and she said she would write something, and it just dropped. And I thought it was just one of those things. I've been thinking about Rachel a lot when I've been preparing this talk and this year. And she was a brilliant writer about other writers, and she was a brilliant writer about Philip Larkin. And the last time I was in Hull was for the Larkin Society conference in 2022, and she gave a brilliant talk. I think it was titled Larkin and Cancel Culture. But it was really about the years after the Larkin's biography and letters came out, and how that changed his reputation. And she had a lot of very wise things to say. I think I'm going to begin with something Rachel wrote about Larkin, because I think it's a good introduction to what I'm going to say about The Less Deceived. And I think it also, in a way, it sort of contradicts a few things I'm going to say, so it's quite nice to have it there to begin with. So this is something Rachel wrote. I think it was for the was it the 100 years? I think it was a couple of years ago. So she says, when I talk about how I found Larkin as a teenager, I know I sound slightly mad. When I tell people that I regard him as having saved my life, I wonder if they think I'm being self-conscious after the fact. But there it is. He turned things around for me, a girl who'd given up drinking and nightclubs, given up school, sorry, for drinking and nightclubs. Key distinction. My dad was a fan of Larkin's. A yellowing copy of his late great poem, Bombard, snipped from the pages of the TLS, was permanently pinned to the notice board in our kitchen. And it was him who first told me to read him, pressing an old hard book of the Whitsun weddings into my reluctant hands. The shock was considerable. This was stuff I could read. And it was so good too, so profound. My older self agrees strongly with my teenage self, who saw straight off that Larkin's verse not only had to do with work and death and bad sex, that he wrote exquisite love poems too. Love, though, I was panicky about it, and not only because of the mayhem at home. Several girls had left school early, having taken no exams. Sometimes I'd see them on the bus, folding their baby buggies and experienced something close to terror. I mean, I currently have a baby buggy. It hasn't been terrible, but I recognise some of that feeling. What was amazing was that Larkin had written a poem about this too. Afternoons, in which women at a playground look on as their children search for unripe acorns. I read Afternoons, and this is a quote, something is pushing them to the side of their own lives, and something shoved me, not to the edge of my life, but towards its centre again. I could see a possible route ahead, and as peculiar and as daft as this may sound, one of the people that held my hand as I picked my way along that path was that old sculpted egg. Say anything you like about Larkin, alas, I know you will, but don't ever tell me that he doesn't, at points, know more about your life than you do yourself. From his own predicaments, clarity. A crystalline reality to be learned by the rest of us by heart. Before we go on, is the mic helping, or is it not? Yeah, it's because I can just not use that and read it. So the Less Deceived. It was a surprising introduction, but it's it's been a pleasure to sort of spend a lot of time with the book as a book this year. And I thought what I would do today is treat it as a book review. So treat it like a book I would be reviewing now, but then also look at what writers at the time said about it. Which I think is a nice way in because it also helps to kind of find a way through some of the cliches around Larkin developed over the years and see him for what he was at the time in 1955, which was a new writer. And it's odd because in many ways in 1955 he wasn't a new writer. He was 33 years old, which to me seems very young. But in writing careers, a lot of people have got a few books behind them by that point, and he had written, as lots of you will know, 2 novels. Phil and I were just talking earlier about apparently the first novel, Jill, wasn't in the flyleaf to The Less Deceived because it wasn't something to be proud of necessarily, because the publisher wasn't seen as a particularly reputable publisher. But he had two novels and a whole book of poems, The North Ship, which had been published 10 years before. So he wasn't a new writer, and yet when you read the reviews, it's clear that people think that something new has happened. He's on the strength of the book, he's seen as a novelty. There's a nice quote from Donald Davy, who is he's not a very well-known poet now, Donald Davy, but I've been reading quite a lot recently, and I'm a fan. And he's a great critic, and Davy is one of the people that I think when this book comes out really understands why it's so good. And he says that the Less Deceived is just about the most important novelty in the British poetic scene since the end of the war. And it's achieved this, Davy suggests, despite eschewing nearly all the shock tactics of defiant originality. And I like the word nearly all, because he doesn't actually then go on to tell us what the shock tactics might be, but I have a few suggestions. And A.E. Tolley, who wrote a piece for the Larkin Society conference about 20 years ago, which is on the website, which is one of the useful things for writing this. So I'm very grateful to him. Writes a piece about The Less Deceived, and he talks about having already had his own tastes formed by the time the book came out. So he's an example of someone that was there at the time and was experiencing this book as someone that had already thought they knew about what contemporary poetry was like, and he kind of describes the surprise and the shock of hearing an idiom that I had always wanted to hear. This is his words, yet could not have imagined myself. The author knew and was writing about life as I knew it. And readers clearly agreed, because after a notice in, I think it was the TLS, the book sold out. And they called the publishers, who, this was their first book, I think, that's right. Entirely by surprise, and they went through sort of 5 or 6 impressions. And there was a sudden run on the book, which was more common for poetry then, less common now, but it's still a surprise. So what was novel about the poems? For Tolley, it was partly a question of the way they were written. Poetry, in his words, had never been so aggressively downplayed and downmarket. Larkin did not censor blemishes, so he mentions, washing lines and Wool's distemper boards. And when I first read that poem, I didn't know what Wool's distemper board was, but I knew it was something that shouldn't necessarily be in a poem, and therefore was exciting. And he wondered if the poetry was about work, which again, in the 1950s, there had been poems about work, but not usually from the perspective of the person doing the work. That's a large generalization. And talks about work in the ways that we're all familiar with from Larkin now. So, as a toad, who he wishes that he could be like the man in, I think it probably is a man, in Poetry of Departures, who just chucked up everything and just cleared off. But just as important, I think, as Davy saw, is the way in which that colloquial speech is in novel and cunning harmony with the lyric note. And sometimes I think the lyricism is hidden right there in the idiom. So if you think about chucked up and just cleared off, it's slang, but then there's an echo. So there is a poetry there to it. Other poetry reviews, as poetry reviews and book reviews in general tend to do, try to explain the book by saying that it was very timely, that it was on its time, that it had caught the moment, and this was what was good about it. Which, as someone that writes and reads a lot of reviews, is a kind of, it's a bit of a cliche. It's slightly damning by faint praise often. And there's a good example from Al Alvarez, another poet and critic, who talked about Larkin writing with a particularly British sense of limitation. So he says, Larkin has caught perfectly the wan, underpaid, overtaxed hopelessness that has smothered the country since the war, the sourness of talent without possibilities, the gradual levelling down of all standards to the natural weariness of enlightened suburbanism. And you can kind of hear there the cliche about Larkin is this dour figure that would deepen over time. And like I say, when that move to associate a book with its time so clearly, one of the reasons I'm always a bit skeptical of it in a review is that it doesn't really tell us why we would want to read the book. We know in theory what our own lives and what the country is like. It doesn't tell us what might be enjoyable about reading the book. And reading it now, I think that lyricism is a constant surprise. Just how lyrical it is, I think even compared, this might be a bit of a claim, but even compared to the Books and Weddings and High Windows, I think it is probably the most lyrical of those three collections. The poem I always go back to is Maiden Name, which I'm going to read a bit from here. So, marrying left your maiden name disused. Its 5 light sounds no longer mean your face, your voice, and all your variants of grace. For since you were so thankfully confused by law with someone else, you cannot be semantically the same as that young beauty. It was of her that these 2 words were used. So I think what the teachers in the audience can correct me, but I think that's sibilance. There's lots of S sounds in there, and the word disused at the beginning of the poem always kind of cascades down into these other versions of the word. So face and voice and grace, and then the strong rhymes on confused and used. And it's a kind of love poem, but it's also a poem. It's a love poem to sound, to the sound of someone's name. which we never hear, although we're told to whisper it later on. And one of the things that I felt reading the book as a whole is that those kind of big Larkinian themes like love and death and work are often placeholders for Larkin's deeper fascination with transience, with time, with poetry, which is kind of, if you're interested in lyric poetry, is the sort of the most intense version of the experience of the passing of time. I suspect that's how Larkin might have thought about it. And you can hear that almost in the titles to these poems. Coming, going, arrivals, departures, poetry of departures, church going. So the poems are coming and going, and the first lines themselves are all about arrivals and departures. So this is sort of 5 picked out at random, but not entirely at random because they prove my point. There is an evening coming in across the fields, one never seen before. At once, whatever happens starts receding. The trumpet's voice, loud and authoritative. Once I am sure there's nothing going on. Coming up England by a different line. And I think even if you didn't know what then happens in those poems or what they're about, something's happening immediately. There's a kind of stirring. Stirred is kind of, I think that's a word in this collection. There's an event. And I think the peak of that is absences, which is apparently, I was reading his favourite poem in the book, he said it was, and he originally wanted to name the collection Such Absences. And this absences, almost in every line, is an arrival or a departure. It's moving the whole way through. Again, so rain patters on a sea that tilts and sighs, fast running floors collapsing into hollows, tower suddenly spray-haired, contrawise, a wave drops like a wall, another follows, wilting and scrambling, tirelessly at play, where there are no ships and no shallows. So it's tirelessly at play, it's moving the whole way through. And then I thought even the famous clarity of the poems is slightly deceptive, and sense is often sacrificed to sound. And this, so if you think about the end of Lines in a Young Lady's Photograph album, I've never quite understood the argument, how it moves. There's a kind of suddenly we're crying at the picture, which had been slightly sort of vivacious before. There's a real kind of move there that doesn't make much sense if you just read it as an argument. And I think it was Graham that said on the Leicester Sea podcast that Toads, it's not entirely clear what Toads means by the end, what this sort of spiritual truth is. Maybe we can work it out after if anyone has an idea. But if you read the end, it's not quite clear what he's trying to say. I don't say, so he's comparing the toad work to his own toad-like feelings. For something sufficiently toad-like squats in me too. Its hunkers are heavy as bad luck and cold as snow, and will never allow me to blarney my way of getting the fame and the girl and the money all at one sitting. I don't say one body's the other one's spiritual truth, but I do say it's hard to lose either when you have both. And I think everyone will have a sense that they know what that means, but it's partly to do with the sound. It's the repeating half rhymes which give off the sense of claustrophobia and indecision, unable to choose between two lives. But yeah, what body's the other one's spiritual truth is quite, if it's got a clear meaning at all, it's a hard one to pass. So I think in some ways what is said in the Less Deceived is less important than who is saying it. And this is the book in which the recognisable Larkin persona, the Larkin voice, arrives for the first time. The one that, as Rachel says, knows more about your life at points than you do. And the way that Donald Davey puts this in his review at the time, with a bit of distrust. Donald Davey is a bit slightly cynical that this persona is already suggesting that this persona is maybe slightly a put on, and it's going to become a bit of a millstone for albatross. Wait for Larkin later. Davey says there's an appealing vulnerability to the poems, which achieve their intimacy by an honest laying bare of the poet's not always creditable feelings. So everyone here is probably familiar with those not always creditable feelings. In Larkin, they are death, self-disgust, misanthropy, beyond all this, the wish to be alone, work and boredom, which we talked about. And it's interesting how many of the early reviews, they single out toads, and they single out poetry of departures as the kind of key poems from the collection, which I think now maybe people talk about Churchill, but those are the ones they pick out, because they felt new. But all of those feelings, it's worth saying, they're not limited to the underpaid, overtaxed Britain of the 1950s, however familiar that Britain might sound. They aren't even limited to Britain. There's a quote, I'm quite surprised by this. I'm always surprised by things which suggest that maybe I should have less preconceptions. But there's a quote by Robert Lowell on this edition, the American poet, who says, all the poems click for me. They have something to say, and I think he has enriched English poetry with a new language that makes us all seem somehow antiquated. It's a homely, sophisticated language that mixed description with a personal voice. No post-war poetry has caught the moment again, and caught it without straining after ephemera. This is something new and imperishable. I mean, that is very high praise from a very great poet, but also from an American poet who is saying that this English poet is new. So I've slightly lost my track there. But I think when we're thinking about what is new, as important as all those themes put together, really, to this book, is the frank and frankly hostile way in which Larkin writes about his own feelings about love and sex and relationships. Larkin would go on writing about all those things until the end, but arguably never with quite the same intensity or at the same rate. And inevitably, critics, when they talk about Larkin's love poems, I've put love in kind of inverted commas, even though some of them really are love poems, they end up focusing on the real life relationships which inspire the poems for understandable reasons. But I think for the less deceived, if we're trying to understand what makes it new, the cultural moment really matters just as much, if not more, than Larkin's life. So Larkin himself thought that the book was, he writes in a letter, too sexy for the Dolman Press, who were an Irish publisher who Donald Davey actually suggested that he send the poems to, and they rejected them. And Larkin's suspicion was because of the subject matter, and supposedly Davey basically implies in the reply that that's right. But there's no mention of really the love poems in Davey's review. There's no mention of them in Alvarez's review. There's no mention of them on the Wikipedia page. Just talks about death, diminishment, and loss. The only of the reviews, contemporary reviews I read, the only one that recognises that these poems are central is one by a poet called Roy Fuller, the father of another poet called John Fuller, who talks about not exactly love poems. So, they're not exactly love poems. When you read them, three things stand out. One is the sheer variety of stylistic approaches. So there's the kind of grim symbolism of dry point and whatever happened. There's the kind of uneasy charm of lines on a young lady's photograph album, which is both sweet and sinister. There's also the sort of uncomfortably clinical depiction of sexual assault in Deceptions. The other thing that really stands out is the precise choice of vocabulary. So when we talk about Larkin's diction and the change since his earlier poems and the change since poets that have come before, when he's writing about sex and love, that's when he's most explicit. So you can't pretend that he's talking about something else. And again, there's often a hint of violence. So the dancers move this way and that. The swivel eye hungers from pose to pose. And like I say, this is all a huge change from the North Ship, which is very abstract, very sort of abstract, very kind of ordinance, I think. And then there's lots of lovers in the North Ship, and they're sort of kissing farewell, or touching each other's hair, or sort of swooning. I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's all slightly put on. But the overriding note in The Less Deceived is, I think, is hostility and distrust to love and sex. That is a bit of an exaggeration. When I finished writing this, I thought, actually, if I did this talk again, I would want to talk more about poems like Wedding Wind or Coming, and the ways in which Larkin, when he's not writing about his own romantic relationships, finds other ways of talking about love. I think those are as important. But since we are talking about those poems, the overriding note is, I think, is distrust. Some of this is couched in universal terms. So to think the lion's share of happiness is found by couples' sheer inaccuracy. Some of it is, much of it is explicitly gendered, so it's about men. Male desire is erratic, it's self-deceiving, it's inauthentic. It's also, in Deceptions, a permanent and inescapable stain, one which the poet deliberately refuses to distance himself from. The book that I found really helpful for this is, it's an extract from a book by someone called Steve Clark called Sordid Images. And Clark is talking about what he calls the sexual politics of Larkin's poetry, and he says that in Deceptions, the poem is both a statement about the limit of the male perspective, because halfway through he says, "I would not dare console you if I could." And at that point, the poem moves into this really queasy, uncomfortable identification with the assailant. And that has been controversial, and there's lots of different readings of that, but the Clark's reading, which I think I agree with, is that by doing that, Larkin is saying he's refusing to piously disavow his own identification with the other man, and it's an acknowledgement of shameful complicity. It's a statement about how Larkin sees men in pursuit of women. So when critics look back at this book, it's often framed as a reaction against the poetry of the 1940s. Out went Dylan Thomas and the poetry of the apocalypse and this kind of rhetorical excess. And in came plain speech and formal stanzas and statement making. And clearly there's an element of truth in that. I've been sort of trying to paint a slightly different picture. But it also, true or not, it doesn't really tell us quite how shocking it would have been at the time. And I think that's partly because ordinary diction, this kind of attempt by poets to find a more ordinary speaking voice in their poetry, is something that happens in every generation of poets, since Wordsworth probably before, is trying to write in a more accessible manner. And in a way, Larkin is doing that brilliantly. but he's following a kind of a trend that's already there from, like I say, from Wordsworth, definitely from Hardy and then Auden. But he's just bringing it even more into the present. And so that's a break, but it's not actually that as new as it might appear in retrospect. What to me feels like a sharper break with tradition, with poetry that had been written in maybe sort of 200 years before the letter C, is that he's putting male desire on trial, and for Larkin, male desire stands for desire in general, and in that sense, he's putting sort of 2 centuries of poetry on trial, and trying to work out what you can write and how you can make a beautiful poem while having the feelings that Larkin does, and trying to be honest about those feelings. And the other thing that struck me when I was writing this, and this is a whole talk in itself, so maybe we'll go into a book or something, but is that the poems are also, in the way that they're so explicit, and in the way that they're so cynical about sex, is that they're also at a strange angle to his own times. So he's writing in 1955. The Obscenity Act is still in force. The Society of Authors had just introduced a bill to Parliament that would end up with the Obscenity Act, which basically gave the state the right to burn books if they thought they were too explicit, would be repealed in 1959, and then there's the Lady Chatterley's Lovers case, which Larkin writes about. But that's all still to happen. So he's writing in this moment before the 1960s. And he's writing before it, and in that sense he's preempting it. He's ahead of his time. He's daring, but he's also expressing a really deep skepticism about the kind of promises of liberation of that period. He's already saying, you know what, it doesn't matter because this won't make you happy, sex won't make you happy. And so it's a strangely out of time book. And I think at the same time, that predicament that Larkin finds, which is that he's ahead of his time, but he's also out of his time. He's more explicit, but more skeptical. That is the predicament that inspires much of the great poems in Books and Weddings and in High Windows. And so that's what he's found in his book. He's found his problem. And that's as much as anything is why it marks the arrival of Larkin. That's it.